This lecture is entitled Gender and Preaching. The term gender and preaching connotes homiletic issues concerning social and cultural constructions related to the biological differences between the sexes. This is an immense and complex topic for which the scope of this lecture is no match. Gender influences virtually every element of homiletics, including pastoral authority, sermon preparation, biblical hermeneutics, delivery, language, imagery, experience, embodiment, voice, ordination, history of preaching, race, culture, sexuality, sexual identity, pedagogy, justice, rhetoric, ethics, ecclesiology, Christology, liturgy, and church architecture, to name only a few. In this lecture, I shall attempt simply to introduce some of the important themes pertaining to the topic of gender and preaching. The pulpit is a useful place to begin our discussion. Virginia Purvis Smith observes, when a clergywoman preaches from a pulpit, she enters a space which has particular aesthetic value, for this space has been occupied and its character defined by male presence for centuries. She further notes that women experience the milieu of the pulpit as uncongenial because it has been a masculine-defined place for so long. For example, one woman had to stand on Coca-Cola cases in order to be seen as she preached from the pulpit. Similar stories abound. Many women preachers prefer not to use the pulpit when preaching. According to Jane Kraske, some women dislike the symbol of the pulpit because it is constraining and because it is a sign of separation between preacher and congregation. Teresa Fry Brown highlights the gendered nature of ecclesial space when she comments on the big chair syndrome in some churches, in which lay women will not sit in the preacher's chair. She says, I have been in churches where women were not allowed to sit in the pulpit, and God forbid they should touch the center chair. Women are not deemed clean enough to stand in the pulpit, and they never get to the chair. Roxanne Mountford argues that the androcentric architecture of the pulpit reinforces the masculine tradition found in preaching manuals. Homiletic notables such as Henry Ward Beecher and John Broadus argued that the good man of the pulpit should be a manly man. While other homiletic textbooks have not been so explicit about the need for manliness in the pulpit, they nonetheless communicate and perpetuate the masculine tradition through what Mountford calls a smooth surface of universal advice, untroubled by the specificity of gender. In recent decades, however, some homiletic literature has become appropriately troubled by the specificity of gender, especially through female scholarship on preaching. In 1989, homiletician Christine Smith published Weaving the Sermon, Preaching in a Feminist Perspective. She claimed, there is distinctive female experience and particularity that all women bring to the task of preaching that is different from the particularity that men bring to the act and craft of preaching. The category of female experience is paramount for women preachers. It is often argued that women experience life and preaching in terms of connection and intimacy, whereas men experience life and preaching in terms of disconnection and individuality. Mary Lynn Hudson and Mary Donovan Turner insist that women preachers must believe in their own experience in order to believe in their own homiletic voices. While no two individuals share precisely the same experience, Unju Mary Kim notes that feminist theories and women's studies affirm that women's experiences have a common denominator: marginality. Since women have been marginalized and silenced by the broader culture and by the church at large for so long, women must strive to find their voice. Voice is a critical topic in homiletics, and nowhere is it more salient than in discussions of gender and preaching. After centuries of a male-only pulpit, women preachers not only look different, they also sound different. The sound of female voices subverts a long-standing sonic culture in the church. And as a result, women are often criticized for speaking too softly, or for speaking too loudly, or for speaking in tones that are too high-pitched, or for trying to sound like a man. Hudson and Turner entreat women preachers to find their own voice in a sometimes hostile ecclesial environment. They employ the metaphor of voice to help women preachers overcome the culture's efforts to silence them. Just as everyone has a unique fingerprint, everyone also has a unique voice print. Voice is an authentic expression of a unique self and an instrument of power by which women claim the value of their experience and speak resistance against oppression. According to Hudson and Turner, women must unlearn not to speak so that they can trust their own voice and the sermon can be populated with their own accent. They argue that imagination is a key element in developing voice because it allows women to hold on to a positive view of themselves no matter what the world tells them they are. It is in stimulating this imagination, they say, that preaching begins. Since the voice is the self's authoritative expression, to find one's voice is to exercise authority. Female homileticians often view authority differently than their male counterparts. Many women view pastoral authority in terms of relationship rather than hierarchy, and in terms of authenticity rather than expertise. Additionally, since the scriptures discuss mainly male experience, women often understand biblical authority differently from men. Given that some biblical texts, such as 1 Timothy 2, 9 through 15, have been deployed to oppress women for centuries, Hudson and Turner say women preachers must read with suspicion. Gender differences also influence paradigms of sermon preparation. Instead of an androcentric, rational approach to sermon development, female homileticians often describe a creative process. For example, in her book, Birthing the Sermon, Jana Childers speaks about sermon preparation in terms of the birth cycle. She says women, quote, know what it is like to conceive, nourish, and give birth to a sermon. Gender issues in preaching point not only toward the one occupying the pulpit, but also toward those populating the pews. Female experience of listening to sermons must be considered. This means gender-inclusive language for God and humanity is an important consideration in preaching and in the liturgy as a whole. Unju Mary Kim calls for new language for naming God based on women's particular experiences. Robert Howard draws particular attention to sermonic images. He says, the images in the majority of contemporary sermons are androcentric, forcing women to identify with a male point of view. Howard insists that preachers use strategically inclusive language systems. Racial differences are another factor that further complicate women's perspectives on preaching. Smith states, black women experience preaching quite differently from white women. This can be demonstrated by briefly juxtaposing the perspectives of white homiletician Lucy Atkinson Rose and African-American homiletician Teresa Fry Brown. Rose claims that women view preaching in terms of connectedness with the congregation, and she decries the traditional assumption that there is a gap between preacher and laity. Brown, on the other hand, assumes a disconnection between preacher and congregation, as she declares, the herald stands in the gap between God and the people. Rose envisions preaching as emerging from conversations within Christian community. Yet Brown envisions preaching as emerging primarily from the preacher's individual conversation with the Holy Spirit. Brown says, I define preaching as the verbal or nonverbal communication of the inward manifestation of a command by the Holy Spirit to relate to others something about God's presence, purpose, and power in one's life and in the lives of all humanity. Rose and Brown's starkly different homiletic approaches and theories remind us not to reduce women's preaching or women's homiletics to some sort of monolith, not to essentialize gender in preaching. If racial diversity complicates women's views of preaching, sexual orientation adds another level of complexity to discussions of gender in preaching. Speaking for many gay and lesbian Christians, Christine Smith declares, "Ours is a much more radical critique of basic gender identity, male-female role constructions, heterosexist social systems, culture, and theology." According to Smith, gay and lesbian voices argue that narrow gender constructions are idolatrous, and so preaching must function to deconstruct gender altogether. Overall, Hudson and Turner remind us that the struggle for voice is not only a struggle to speak, but also a search for an audience to listen. The two oldest Christian traditions, Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy, do not officially ordain women to the priesthood. And while women's ordination in the United States has increased greatly in the past 60 years, the two largest Christian groups in America today, Roman Catholics and Southern Baptists, do not officially ordain women to be preachers of the gospel. Even within denominations that ordain women, gender inequality perseveres. In 2006, Neela Banerjee published a piece in the New York Times that was headlined, "Clergywomen Find Hard Path to Bigger Pulpit." According to Banerjee, in mainline Protestant churches that have been ordaining women for decades, women account for only a small percentage, about 3%, of pastors who lead large congregations, those with average Sunday attendance over 350. The stained glass ceiling holds firm in this sense. In some mainline denominations, it is easier for women to be appointed bishops than to become pastors of large congregations. This is due to the fact that churchgoers often have trouble accepting a female preacher. One female minister reports that a search committee member at a mainline Protestant church said to her, "We really didn't want a woman because we know we're dying when we get a woman." Ironically, says Banerjee, in Protestant traditions that do not ordain women, such as evangelical megachurches, lay women who lead youth groups or women's groups influence the faith of hundreds of congregants in a way that a woman minister in a small church cannot. In summary, pastors do well to consider several points pertaining to gender and preaching, as does every student of homiletics. Number one, a good way to promote justice in the area of gender and preaching is by having women speak in the pulpit or preach in the pulpit. As Brown states, our presence in the pulpit alone is a visual for justice. Number two, the male viewpoint should not be considered normative in preaching. We must continually provincialize male homiletics so that a masculine approach is not assumed to be normative or neutral or objective. Number three, sermonic language should be mindful of female listeners' experience and perspectives and should strive to be as inclusive as possible in language and imagery. Number four, those who hold traditional understandings of pastoral and biblical authority do well to weigh critiques from people whose voices are variously gendered. Number five, the category of women's experience is not monolithic, but rather is complicated by race, socioeconomic status, cultural background, personal circumstances, and other factors. Therefore, we also do well to provincialize white women's experience so that it is not considered to be the normative women's experience. And six, issues of gender in preaching remind all preachers that sermons are not manuscripts and manuscripts are not sermons. Sermons are not outlines and outlines are not sermons. Preaching is an embodied performance in which body language and vocal dynamics are absolutely paramount. Let us make every effort then toward just ways of theorizing and practicing homiletic embodiment and the preaching voice as well as homiletic theory and reflection.